Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Radio Free Acton, the official podcast of the Acton Institute dedicated to the study of religion and liberty. I'm your host, Caroline Roberts, and on today's episode, we'll start with a segment from one of our summer interns, Victoria Antrim. Victoria talks about the myths of entrepreneurship with Luke Burgess, who started his first company at the age of 24, and by Business Week was named a top 25 entrepreneur under 25 for starting one of the most innovative food access businesses in the country. His most recent ventures integrate Catholic social teaching and have a strong social and cultural mission. After that, we bring you another Upstream segment, the part of the show where we discuss all things cultural. Host Bruce Edward Walker speaks with Jay Bradley Studemeyer, a research assistant at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Jay and Bruce discuss government-funded art in light of the upcoming book, Art from the Swamp. If you're interested in checking out any resources in today's episode, you can find them in our show notes, published each Wednesday at blog.acton.org.
Today, we are discussing the myths of entrepreneurship with Luke Burgess, entrepreneur and resident at Catholic University of America, Bush School of Business. Thanks for coming on the show today, Luke.
Thanks for having me, Victoria.
So to get started, let's talk about successful entrepreneurs. There's a misconception that if an entrepreneur is successful, that he's never failed. Is this true?
Yeah, well, we don't want to fetishize failure, right? We talk about failing fast and whoever fails the most wins, and Silicon Valley does that a lot because failure really hurts. I think what's important to understand is that failure is a skill, and we can actually learn to fail well. And if you fail too big, you don't get to fail anymore. And if you never fail, then you haven't actually done anything. So learning to fail well is what's critical. I think every successful entrepreneur that I've ever known has failed. And there's nothing good about failure in and of itself, even though sometimes it can be used as a badge of honor in the entrepreneurial community. But learning to fail well is a skill, and that has a lot to do with mindset and attitude. I think there's a lot of skills that we can learn in the process of failure, personal development, developing virtues, learning that, I can give you an example of something that I learned, putting myself out there in a public and visible way. Because when I don't do that and I fail, I can very easily find excuses for why I failed. Right? I have a friend who tried to quit smoking for 5 years, and he would never tell anybody when he was going to attempt to quit. Which meant that when he failed, he wasn't accountable and he could come up with all kinds of reasons. When he actually put it out there, it took it to a whole different level, and he couldn't tell himself some of those lies about why he failed. So that's one of those things that I've learned to do. I take visible and public roles, and when I fail, I have failed publicly, and I've learned more from that than sort of those invisible things that I've tried to keep hidden.
On the same note of skills that entrepreneurs have, it's a common understanding that a formal business background is required to be an entrepreneur. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I studied business in undergrad, but I don't have an MBA. There's a great book that I would recommend called The Illusions of Entrepreneurship by a guy named Scott Shane. And he says, education in business is good up to a certain extent, but just don't get a PhD because then all you'll do is talk about business and entrepreneurship like me. Right. So I am a huge fan of the liberal arts and the humanities. And I have to be honest, if I could go back and do it all over again, I would probably have majored in something like English or literature, philosophy in undergrad. Because business at the end of the day is, has a lot to do with understanding people and human nature. And that's what we learn in the humanities. So there's so many people I could tell you that have no really formal business education. I believe Carly Fiorina studied medieval history in undergrad. Ken Chenault, CEO of American Express, was a history major. Sam Palmisano, former CEO of IBM, history major. Hank Paulson studied English. Carl Icahn, philosophy at Princeton. So these are all people that have went on to be very successful leaders and CEOs that had degrees in the humanities. So I would say formal business education is nice, and I do have some of it, but by no means is it a requirement to be a good entrepreneur.
There's this common misconception that it's all about the product or whatever great idea you have that will ultimately determine your success. Is that all that matters?
Yeah, absolutely not. I think people can get lucky and stumble on a great product idea, but eventually the luck runs out because an idea is not a business. An idea is the start of putting together a business model and a business canvas. So sure, ideas are important, there's no doubt, but so are all of the human virtues that come into play that ultimately mean the difference between success and failure. Magnanimity, patience, fortitude, perseverance, prudence. These are entrepreneurial virtues that turn ideas into success. And I would say there's a myth in the entrepreneurial world that good ideas and products sell themselves. And I think nothing can be further from the truth. I think that the role of sales is really underappreciated. And it requires a certain amount of humility to say, hey, I'm an entrepreneur and I've got this great idea, but it's not going to go anywhere unless I bring in somebody who's a better salesperson than me. Some entrepreneurs are really good at sales, but most that I know are not. I'm not. And I know that the first person I need to bring in is a good salesperson because good ideas really don't sell themselves.
Yeah, it's really dependent on that support that you have around you. As far as the success of entrepreneurs, everyone believes that it's such an easy way to get rich. This obviously isn't true for all entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I mean, in one sense, yes, but in another sense, no. So first of all, it depends on what your definition of rich is. I would say if you want to be a billionaire or you want to make a lot of money and be in the top, 1% of people, you're probably not going to do it by going to work for 25 years and earning a salary. It's going to come from having an ownership and an equity stake in something, and that often happens through entrepreneurship. So on the other hand, it is extremely difficult being an entrepreneur. There's a lot of myths out there. I think 1/3 of companies make it 7 years. Most entrepreneurs actually make less than they would make if they were working in a traditional industry, in a corporation. So it's hard. And when entrepreneurs do make it, they can have a big exit or a big payout, but it often takes years and years of hard work. I mean, when I started my first company after college, I worked for 3 years just drawing the minimum salary that I could to get by and pay my rent at the end of the month. Then I left a job that paid me a multiple of what I was drawing in salary. And it took a long time before it really paid off.
Besides the whole getting rich is one of the attractive features of being an entrepreneur, there's also a myth about freedom and that there's unlimited freedom when you get to work for yourself.
Yeah, definitely not unlimited, that's for sure. The only area where I've actually experienced more freedom as an entrepreneur, and I've really been one since I was 23, is in how I get to use my time. But of course, time is not unlimited. It's very limited. And as an entrepreneur, there's a lot of responsibilities, and in fact, more responsibilities, not less. So I had a very brief career on Wall Street, like 9 months before I left and started my first company. And, I left Wall Street, I was working 90 hours a week. It's one of the reasons I left, thinking that entrepreneurship would just give me this bunch of freedom and I could, work when I wanted to. Well, it turns out that I had more responsibilities when I owned my own company than when I was an investment banker. And I was the first person to get the phone calls at 10 p.m. So in some senses, related to my greater expanded responsibilities, I had less freedom to do what I wanted because I now have, responsibility for people's lives that I've partnered with and people that I've hired and brought into the company. But I really do appreciate that I can spend my time on the things that I think are creating the most value, which I couldn't always say when I work for somebody else.
Sure. Now that we've covered a bunch of myths, can you give us just one truth of entrepreneurship?
One truth of entrepreneurship. Yeah. I think the only way to know whether you want to be an entrepreneur or whether you're creating value as an entrepreneur is by doing it and by seeing what the response is in the market, right? So, oftentimes there are public policies and messaging that seem to say the more entrepreneurship, the better. With entrepreneurship in and of itself is always a good thing, or more entrepreneurs is a good thing. What we need is the right entrepreneurs doing the right things and actually creating value. And I think that the value creation piece is critical, and the only way to know whether or not you can create value is by actually going out and seeing what the response is to whatever it is that you're offering.
Thank you so much, Luke, for clearing up some of these false ideas. This is Victoria Antrim, and you're listening to Radio Free Acton.
As one of only 2 presidents to have never formally joined a church, people have wondered just how much Abraham Lincoln himself was under God when he said that the United States should consider itself as such, as it strove for a new birth of freedom. However, the Civil War shifted the ground decisively under Lincoln's feet. In the cauldron of war, he discovered that God was not merely a remote force or a faceless universal power, but a personal, intelligent, and willing God who intervened in the affairs of men, to direct them in ways that they could not even begin to imagine. Join us tomorrow, August 9, at the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, to hear Alan Gelzo speak on Abraham Lincoln's Moral Constitution. You can register for this event at acton.org/events.
Hello and welcome to Upstream. I'm your host, Bruce Edward Walker, and today I'm talking to J. Bradley Studemeyer, who was working on the new book, Art from the Swamp, published by Encounter Books and written by the late Bruce Cole. Hello, Jay. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, well, what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit of a stretch for Upstream in that we are talking about art, but we're also talking about politics. We're talking about public funding for the arts, which was one of Bruce Cole's main points of interest. He was the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Tell us a little bit about how you came to be involved in the project, and tell us exactly what your contribution to the project was.
Well, Bruce was an exceptional man, and he kind of used his critiques of the programs that he targeted in this book, and he used them in his own life to try and determine how he behaved. So I appeared kind of out of nowhere. I appeared on his doorstep at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, no prior relationship. He asked me, what I knew about the subject, and it was admittedly very little. But he gave me a little bit of a test and said, if you can do this, you get the job. And that started our collaboration, working on this project that started with the Art and Architecture program and the General Services Administration. And then as Bruce's work on the Eisenhower Memorial Commission kind of kicked into high gear, we started to address that, and then finally the National Endowment for the Arts. So I worked with Bruce from late 2016 until he passed away in early 2018. And it was just an absolute pleasure to kind of learn at the feet of a master. And whenever he passed away, we had most of the book written, but it was really a process of shaping it into something that could be brought out to the public. And so I want to do my best to state that this is Bruce's work, and I was really just there to bring his voice out in the end.
Well, it's terrific. It's a short book, and again, the title is Art from the Swamp, How Washington Bureaucrats Squander Millions on Awful Art. And you begin with a conversation, or I should say, Mr. Cole, and you begin with a conversation on the Eisenhower Memorial. So tell us a little bit about the background of that.
Sure. So Bruce actually came into this process of creating a memorial dedicated to Dwight Eisenhower on the National Mall. He came into this process kind of in medias res, where from the earliest point in its kind of imagining, this process was railroaded by a collection of senators and private citizens that wanted a
and we should
monument
say that
on the National
we should say
Mall.
that it was a bipartisan as well, that politicians that railroaded it.
That's an important theme that kind of runs throughout this book, is that whenever you're inclined to think that this is a one-party issue, you find contributions from both sides that are quite troubling. And from the beginning, this project was bipartisan. A collection of congressmen, senators, and private citizens who were there to create a monument to Dwight Eisenhower.
Including Eisenhower's family.
Including members of Eisenhower's family, his grandchildren. There was kind of a rotating cast of family members who were for it and then against it and then for it again. A big maelstrom of just confusion. And so Bruce was appointed to this committee relatively late in the process, but he got to kind of see from the inside just the bureaucratic mess that it was creating a monument that really had no public backing or any public upsurging saying that we want this monument.
Well, let's move forward from the Eisenhower Memorial to your next chapter, where you're talking about government-funded architecture. We admittedly, there's just some hideous government-funded architecture out there.
Oh, sure, and that's one of the strengths, I think, of this book that might run a little bit beneath the surface, is that people who would want to attack Bruce as uneducated or unsophisticated or just another person saying that he hated art, those criticisms are going to be baseless, because this was a man with a long background in art history. He knew art and he loved it, and when he saw bad art, he had no problem saying that it was bad art. And with the art and architecture program, he thought the bad art all started from this process where the artist was picked before any artwork was ever even put on the table, that the art and architecture program was there to create art that pleased critics, the day it was announced, but it wasn't there to be appreciated by future generations of citizens, or really even most of the citizens in the present moment.
Let's go to the National Endowment for the Arts, because this is something that I've written on quite a bit in the past, and I'm looking at page 91 of the advanced copy of the book that I have, and I'm looking at numbers that are just mind-boggling, staggering, that the National Endowment for the Arts has $50 million to state, territory, and regional arts councils. That is just stupendous. I mean, the beginning of the NEA was part of the Great Society program. So talk a little bit about the history of that and the amount of monies that went to it, and then we'll get into some specifics of the artwork and presentations that is funded with my money and your money and right. Producer Caroline Roberts' money.
Right. It's your money, and you're probably never going to know how it's spent. With the NEA, obviously it's that $50 million total each year that's being distributed to the states, the territories, and the regional art councils. And the idea behind that distribution in the beginning was that, this will plant the seeds for art in each of these communities, and it'll create kind of a seeding effect, that local artists will then be inspired by that art, and it will create some sort of self-sustaining scene. But we know that hasn't happened. And furthermore, this money that's supposed to be pretty explicitly divided up, you see it being circulated around between a state art council can receive money, but then give it right back to a regional art council to determine how it's going to be distributed. So it creates this bureaucratic kind of cesspool where the money, it keeps growing almost year after year. We have a chart, I believe, in the back of the book that shows how the money is increased, but it's a nightmare. It
looks almost like a Jackson Pollock, trying to follow the money as it goes in and out of all of these different councils and groups. And I've had similar experiences trying to document where the money comes from and where it goes in public broadcasting, because it's the same quagmire. It's just difficult to determine how much money is going where and who's paying for what. And then at the end of the day, you have individuals like Garrison Keillor or Sesame Street who are making just bundles of money off of merchandise.
Right. Yeah. And, that's kind of, that was another theme in all of this, is that there's this idea that it's welfare for the rich or welfare for the elite, that artists who already have an established reputation are getting the bulk of these funds and then, improving their own reputation and money-making abilities off of it.
Well, and one of those would be Alexander Calder, and you write in the book about something that is installed just a few blocks from where I'm recording this in the Acton Institute studios. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. With the Calder piece, there was this real resistance to it being installed at the beginning, but as with most of these pieces, there was someone influential behind it who essentially stated that this needs to be here, and we know better than the members of the community what is needed. Calder designed it and built it in France, then shipped it over. And whenever people questioned him about it, said, well, why are you taking over the identity of this city and putting your own mark on it? He essentially said, well, the plaza where this piece is installed, it belongs to the piece now. So it's really nothing that can be argued. It's a great bit of arrogance, really. And the piece is called Le Grand Vitesse, and there's no discernible tie-in with the community. But that just continues this theme that you see in the art and architecture program, where there's no ties between the art and the community. There's no preference given to the artist's origin or location. There's no concern really for regional art themes or practices. So you get these monstrous pieces that seem placeless, placed into communities where people are only going to be confused.
Well, and to maybe bait some of the individuals who actually support government-funded art, I will put myself on the line as a Philistine to say, okay, there's a lot of just nonsense that is being funded by this. In the book, there's Ann Carlson's Doggy Hamlet. There's Walls, which is giving money to mimes in San Francisco to talk about gun control and immigration and what have you. And you can take this all the way back to the kerfuffle over Andre Serrano and Robert Mapplethorpe. And for Serrano, we'll just say PC for the title of something that is obviously not PC. And Robert Mapplethorpe's The Perfect Moment, which is pretty objectionable to the rank and file of American taxpayers.
Absolutely. And with pieces like that, any of these pieces that tend to take a political line, which admittedly seems to be quite a lot of them, you have to wonder whether this is really the funding of art or the funding of outright propaganda. And it's a difficult line to draw, but whenever the question comes up, you ask why art is being funded at all by the federal government. And that's something that Bruce and I spent a lot of time kind of talking back and forth about. And Bruce was nothing if not a realist. He saw that, if after Serrano and Mapplethorpe, if after those two, federal funding for the arts still was there, then there was no real chance of ever doing away with them entirely. So the focus had to be on reforming them. And it's bringing to light pieces like Doggy Hamlet, where sheepdogs are used to herd sheep in a field, supposedly inspired by the Shakespeare work Hamlet, or by this mime play called Walls. It's focusing in on those to make the public aware of them that could actually bring about reform.
Well, it certainly got my blood boiling, but it's always been on a low boil anyway. Do we really need government-funded art? Would art survive without the government's interference?
Oh, I think that's beyond a shadow of a doubt. Of course it would. And, great art is constantly being produced without government assistance. But, this is one of the big issues that we attempted to work around is regardless of the need, regardless of any demonstrable evidence that you can give, art is going to be made by the federal government, or it's going to be supported by the federal government. It's a sad reality, but I think it's a reality nonetheless. And it has to do with that, with the Reagan quotation, right? That the closest thing you can get to immortality is a government program. And if that's the truth, and unfortunately I think it is, then what we can hope to do is try and shepherd it into a place where this money is being spent more responsibly. It isn't being used by people kind of behind these walls and in shadowy places to give money to their friends. It's not being used to make out and out statements about some sort of controversy of the day, but it's being used to make beautiful works of art that tell the stories of our country, tell the stories of our values, what's gotten us to this point, and where we think we're going. I can't remember the last time, or actually I can't remember any time I've ever spoken to a friend about art at a federal building. Hey, we need to go see this for the purpose of seeing a beautiful work of art. Now I've taken plenty of friends over to federal buildings to see the monstrosities in front. But the fact that citizens aren't queuing up outside of federal buildings to see these impassioned, beautiful works of art, that should be a pretty clear sign right there that whatever they're doing right now is not working.
I'm talking with J. Bradley Studemeyer, who helped finish the book Art from the Swamp, written by Bruce Cole and released by Encounter Books. Jay, thank you so much for explaining the book to us and sharing your experiences with Bruce Cole.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, great. And for Upstream, I'm your host, Bruce Edward Walker. I'd like to thank my producer, Caroline Roberts, and my executive producer, John Coritas. For Upstream, again, I'm Bruce Edward Walker, and we'll talk to you again next week.
And with that, we've come to the end of another episode. Thank you for listening today. Let your friends know that you can now find Radio Free Acton on most podcast apps, along with Spotify and YouTube. If you're interested in reaching our podcast team here at the Acton Institute, you can email us at rfa@acton.org, or you can leave us a message at 888-705-4180. Lastly, if you like what you hear on Radio Free Acton, don't forget to give us a rating on iTunes. This episode is produced by myself, Caroline Roberts, and edited by Nathan Moore.